Transcribed by TurboScribe, AI, go unlimited to remove this message. I walked into our Boston apartment Thursday evening, rolling my carry-on behind me and expecting to surprise Rachel with my early return from the Chicago conference. The project management summit had ended a day ahead of schedule, and I'd managed to catch an earlier flight home, thinking we could spend the evening together before the weekend rush started. I'd even stopped at that bakery on Newberry Street. She loved to pick up those expensive macarons she always talked about but never bought for herself, imagining her face when I walked through the door with her favorite lavender honey flavor. Instead, I found her methodically folding designer clothes into her matching leather luggage set. The expensive one her parents had bought her for graduation 3 years ago that she only used for important trips like visiting her sister in New York or those work retreats in Vermont. The sight stopped me cold in our bedroom doorway, macarons forgotten in my left hand while my brain struggled to process what I was seeing. She looked up from a silk blouse she was wrapping in tissue paper, her expression shifting from concentration to something that looked almost like guilt, then hardening into the determined mask I'd learned over 7 years meant she'd already made up her mind about something and no amount of discussion would change it. I knew Rachel well enough to recognize when she was preparing to deliver news that would change everything, but I still wasn't prepared for what came next. She told me she was leaving, not just for the weekend or a work trip, but permanently, and that she'd been seeing someone else for nearly 6 months while I'd been completely oblivious to the signs. Trevor worked at a luxury car dealership downtown, managing high-end sales to Boston's wealthy elite, and they'd met at a charity gala in March that I'd skipped because of a critical work deadline for a client presentation that had seemed important at the time. She explained this with the clinical detachment of someone discussing quarterly earnings, folding each piece of clothing with precise movements while informing me that our entire relationship had been a mistake she was finally ready to correct after years of settling for less than she deserved. The words felt surreal, like watching someone else's life implode in a movie I'd accidentally wandered into while looking for the wrong theater. I stood there processing the information while she continued packing, her movements efficient and practiced, as if she'd rehearsed this moment in her mind countless times during those evenings when I thought she was just tired from work. When I finally found my voice to ask why, she paused in her packing and looked at me with something that might have been pity mixed with the frustration of having to explain something she considered obvious. She told me she felt trapped in our predictable routine, that every Friday night spent playing board games or watching movies at home felt like she was throwing away the prime years of her life on someone who was going nowhere while her friends were living actual lives. The criticism came in carefully measured doses, each observation designed to cut deep while maintaining her composure and superiority. She mentioned how embarrassing it was when her friends talked about spontaneous weekend trips to Martha's Vineyard or impromptu dinners at exclusive restaurants, while she had to explain that we preferred to save money for more practical things like our emergency fund or retirement contributions. Trevor, apparently, understood the importance of living in the moment and treating weekends like opportunities for adventure rather than obligations to be managed responsibly by someone who lacked vision and spontaneity. She described him as ambitious and successful, someone who drove a BMW and wore expensive watches, unlike me with my practical Honda Civic and my habit of checking restaurant reviews before making reservations. I listened to her methodical destruction of everything I thought we'd built together, each word confirming that the woman I'd planned to propose to next month had already moved on months ago, leaving me to catch up to a reality I'd been completely oblivious to while thinking we were building something lasting. The engagement ring I'd bought 6 weeks ago was hidden in my sock drawer, a symbol of a future that had apparently never existed except in my imagination. As she continued packing, I realized that while I'd been researching restaurants for a perfect proposal dinner and planning our life together, she'd been comparing me unfavorably to someone who represented everything I wasn't and apparently never could be. Rachel continued her devastating critique with the systematic precision of someone who'd been rehearsing these complaints for months, explaining how embarrassed she felt when her friends discussed their boyfriends' expensive gifts and exotic vacation stories, while she had to mention our budget-conscious lifestyle and Friday night board game traditions that now seemed pathetic in comparison. She told me about conversations at work where her colleagues shared photos from weekends and the Hamptons or spontaneous trips to wine country, while she had to explain that we preferred staying home to save money for practical goals like down payments and retirement funds that suddenly sounded boring and small-minded. The way she described our relationship made it sound like a business arrangement between two people who'd settled for convenience rather than passion, reducing 7 years of what I thought was genuine partnership to a series of compromises that had slowly drained the life out of her dreams and ambitions. She revealed that Trevor represented everything I wasn't: wealthy enough to be spontaneous without checking bank account balances, adventurous enough to suggest midnight drives to see the sunrise over the ocean without worrying about being tired for work the next day, socially connected enough to get reservations at restaurants I'd never even heard of, and confident enough to live without constantly planning every detail of the future like someone afraid of taking risks. Rachel painted him as someone who understood that life was meant to be experienced rather than managed, someone who could give her the excitement and status she'd been missing during our years of what she now called mediocre suburban planning that had turned her into someone she didn't recognize or respect. She described feeling like she was aging prematurely, becoming the kind of person who chose practical shoes over stylish ones and discussed mortgage rates instead of dreams, trapped in a relationship that prioritized security over adventure and responsibility over passion. When I desperately suggested we could try couples therapy to work through whatever problems we were having, thinking that professional help might bridge the gap between what we had and what she apparently needed, she actually laughed. A bitter sound that made me feel naive for thinking our issues could be solved through conversation and compromise rather than fundamental life changes. She told me that some relationships simply couldn't be saved through talking, because the fundamental problem wasn't communication but incompatibility, explaining that no amount of therapy could transform me into the kind of man who could give her the life she'd realized she wanted and deserved after seeing what was possible with someone like Trevor. The finality in her voice made it clear that this wasn't an impulsive decision made in anger or temporary frustration, but a calculated conclusion she'd reached after months of comparing our life to possibilities that Trevor had shown her existed beyond our apartment's walls. As she zipped up her suitcase with decisive movements that suggested she'd been mentally preparing for this departure for weeks, I heard the sound of a car pulling into our apartment complex parking lot, and she glanced toward the window with an expression that mixed relief with something that might have been guilt about the timing of her perfectly orchestrated escape. Through our bedroom window, I watched a black luxury SUV park in the visitor spot, and I knew without being told that Trevor had arrived to collect Rachel and help her transition into the new life she'd been planning behind my back, while I'd been completely oblivious to her growing dissatisfaction with everything we'd built together over 7 years. The sight of him stepping out of an expensive vehicle, tall and confident in a way that made me feel inadequate even from 3 floors up, confirmed every criticism she'd made about my limitations, and drove home the reality that I'd been competing in a game where I never had a chance of winning because I hadn't even known I was playing. I stood there watching my entire future dissolve as Rachel grabbed her bags and walked toward the door without looking back, leaving me alone in an apartment that suddenly felt enormous and empty, filled with reminders of a relationship that had apparently been over long before I realized it was ending. I spent the next week systematically dismantling the life Rachel and I had built together, approaching the task with the same methodical precision I used for project management at work, treating it as a complex problem that required logical solutions rather than emotional processing. I contacted our landlord to discuss breaking our lease early, explaining the situation in professional terms that avoided the messy details of betrayal and abandonment, and was relieved when he agreed to let me out of the contract with only a 1-month penalty fee that seemed like a small price to pay for a clean escape from memories embedded in every corner of our shared space. I packed my belongings with military efficiency, separating my possessions from the furniture we'd bought together and the decorative items that had somehow become symbols of a future that no longer existed, donating most of the shared items to charity rather than fighting over who deserved what from our dissolved partnership. My college roommate Mitchell offered me his guest room in Cambridge while I figured out my next steps, and staying with him felt like traveling back in time to a simpler period when my biggest concern was finding a decent job rather than rebuilding my entire conception of love and trust. I blocked Rachel across all social media platforms and changed my phone number, refusing to engage with her attempts to contact me through mutual friends who seemed to think I should be interested in hearing her explanations or justifications for the way she'd handled our breakup. When our friend Sarah called to tell me Rachel wanted to talk about getting closure, I politely but firmly explained that closure was something I'd have to create for myself, rather than something she could provide after the damage had already been done to my ability to trust and plan for shared futures. The decision to cut off all communication wasn't made in anger, but in recognition that staying connected to someone who'd spent months living a double life would only prevent me from moving forward into whatever came next. When my supervisor Karen approached me about a promotion opportunity that had opened up in our company's San Diego office, offering me the chance to lead a new project management division focused on sustainable energy initiatives. I accepted immediately without the usual careful consideration I applied to major life decisions. The timing felt like providence, offering me not just career advancement but geographical distance from a city that had become associated with humiliation and broken promises, plus a substantial salary increase that would help me rebuild my financial independence after 7 years of shared expenses and joint planning. The relocation package included moving costs, temporary housing assistance, and the opportunity to build something entirely new in a location where I had no history or expectations to live up to representing exactly the kind of fresh start. I needed to rediscover who I was outside the context of a relationship that had apparently been holding me back. I gave my Boston landlord notice, arranged for professional movers to handle my belongings, and bought a one-way ticket to California with the same efficiency I'd applied to project deadlines, treating my geographical escape as just another logistical challenge to be solved through proper planning and execution. Mitchell threw me a going-away party that felt more like a celebration of liberation than a farewell. Surrounded by friends who'd apparently been waiting years for me to realize that Rachel had been gradually isolating me from social activities and personal interests that didn't align with her vision of our coupled future. As I boarded the plane to San Diego with everything I owned reduced to 3 suitcases and a laptop bag, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years: the excitement of unknown possibilities, and the freedom to make decisions based entirely on my own preferences and ambitions, rather than compromising with someone who'd been mentally checked out of our relationship for months. Looking out the airplane window as Boston disappeared below the clouds, I realized that Rachel had actually done me a favor by forcing me to confront the reality that I'd been settling for someone who saw me as a placeholder rather than a destination, and that her betrayal had freed me to discover what I could accomplish when I stopped trying to build a future with someone who didn't want to be there. In San Diego, I threw myself into my new role with an intensity that surprised even me, leading a team of 15 engineers and analysts in developing project management systems for renewable energy installations across California, work that felt meaningful in ways my Boston position never had despite the longer hours and greater responsibility. The demanding schedule became a blessing rather than a burden, keeping my mind occupied with technical challenges and strategic planning, while my personal life slowly rebuilt itself around activities I'd never had time to explore during 7 years of relationship obligations and compromise. I started taking surfing lessons on Saturday mornings at La Jolla Cove, something I'd always been curious about but had never pursued because Rachel considered beach activities boring and impractical, and discovered I had a natural aptitude for reading waves and balancing that gave me confidence I'd forgotten I possessed. Weekend photography workshops in the desert landscapes around San Diego became another outlet, teaching me to see beauty in solitude and vast empty spaces that felt like perfect metaphors for the freedom I'd gained through losing what I'd thought was everything important. My phone started buzzing with messages from unknown numbers in early October, and I realized Rachel had been trying to reach me through various communication methods after discovering I'd blocked her primary channels. Her persistence suggesting that whatever she'd found with Trevor hadn't delivered the satisfaction she'd expected when she made her calculated departure. The first message came through LinkedIn, disguised as a professional networking attempt, but clearly personal when she mentioned hoping I was settling into my new position well and asked if I might be interested in catching up over coffee the next time I was visiting Boston. I deleted it without responding, recognizing the tone of someone testing the waters to see if I'd maintain my boundaries, or if enough time had passed to make me receptive to renewed contact and explanation. When Mitchell called to tell me Rachel had been asking mutual friends for my new contact information, claiming she needed closure and wanted to apologize for how she'd handled things, I felt only mild curiosity about her motivations, rather than the anger or hurt I might have experienced months earlier. He mentioned that she and Trevor had broken up after he'd apparently been dating multiple women simultaneously throughout their relationship, treating her the same way she treated me, but with even less consideration for her feelings or dignity. According to Mitchell, Rachel had quit her marketing job to spend more time with Trevor, expecting their relationship to progress quickly toward marriage and financial security, only to discover that he'd never considered her anything more than temporary entertainment while he explored other options. The irony wasn't lost on me that she'd left someone who'd been committed to building a future together for someone who'd never intended to build anything lasting with her, but I found myself surprisingly indifferent to her misfortune rather than vindicated or satisfied. Mitchell seemed disappointed by my lack of emotional reaction, having apparently expected me to either gloat over her karma or express sympathy for her situation. But I explained that my emotional investment in Rachel's life had completely evaporated along with my trust in her judgment and character. I'd started dating Amanda, a marine biologist I'd met through a weekend volunteer beach cleanup program in Torrey Pines, and our relationship was developing with the natural ease of two people who genuinely enjoyed each other's company rather than the careful negotiation and compromise that had characterized my years with Rachel. Amanda brought intellectual curiosity and genuine enthusiasm to our conversations about environmental conservation, my work projects and shared outdoor adventures, making me realize how much energy I'd been wasting trying to interest someone in topics they found boring or irrelevant to their personal ambitions. With Amanda, I discovered what it felt like to be with someone who asked questions about my day, because she genuinely wanted to know the answers rather than someone who listened politely while mentally planning their next social media post or shopping expedition. Rachel's attempts to reconnect became increasingly desperate as fall turned to winter, escalating from professional networking messages to having her mother Patricia call me directly with elaborate stories about Rachel's emotional breakdown and deep regret over the way she'd ended our relationship. Patricia's phone call came on a Tuesday evening while I was cooking dinner with Amanda, and I listened politely as she explained that Rachel had been crying daily, wasn't eating properly, and kept talking about how she'd made the biggest mistake of her life by choosing excitement over genuine love and partnership. I thanked Patricia for her concern, but explained that Rachel's emotional state wasn't my responsibility anymore, and that healing from our breakup required maintaining the boundaries I'd established rather than reopening communication channels that would only complicate both our attempts to move forward. Her best friend Jessica followed up a week later with a more aggressive approach, calling me selfish and stubborn for refusing to give Rachel the closure she needed to process her guilt and regret about how she'd handled our 7-year relationship. Jessica insisted that the mature response would be to meet Rachel for coffee and listen to her apology, but I explained that maturity sometimes meant accepting that some conversations wouldn't change anything and would only provide false hope for reconciliation that wasn't going to happen. My relationship with Amanda had developed naturally around shared interests in environmental conservation and outdoor adventures, spending weekends hiking in Torrey Pines or volunteering for beach restoration projects that gave us meaningful work to do together rather than just entertainment to consume. She brought genuine intellectual curiosity to our discussions about renewable energy policy and marine ecosystem preservation, making me realize how much I'd missed having a partner who was interested in ideas and causes beyond personal advancement and social status. When Rachel apparently hired a private investigator or used social media detective work to discover my relationship with Amanda, she sent a series of lengthy emails that alternated between self-deprecating apologies and angry accusations that I'd never truly fought for our relationship, or given her adequate time to work through her confusion about what she wanted from life. The emails revealed a level of desperation and entitlement that made me grateful for the distance I'd created, particularly when she suggested that my quick transition to a new relationship proved I'd never really loved her the way she'd convinced herself I had during the years we were together. I changed my phone number and email address again, this time using a service that would forward only messages from pre-approved contacts, effectively creating a digital barrier that would prevent any further communication attempts while allowing my professional and personal relationships to continue uninterrupted. Amanda never asked me to cut off contact with Rachel because she trusted me to handle the situation appropriately, demonstrating the kind of secure confidence that I realized had been missing from my relationship with someone who'd constantly needed reassurance about my commitment while simultaneously planning her exit strategy. Our relationship deepened through shared experiences rather than dramatic declarations, building trust through consistent actions and compatible values rather than the emotional intensity and constant negotiation that had characterized my years with Rachel. When Amanda suggested we take a weekend trip to Joshua Tree National Park for her birthday, I found myself excited about the planning process rather than anxious about whether my efforts would be appreciated or criticized for being too predictable or insufficiently spontaneous. The contrast between planning adventures with someone who valued thoughtfulness versus someone who interpreted planning as evidence of boring predictability made me understand how much emotional energy I'd been wasting trying to satisfy someone who viewed my strengths as limitations. By December, I realized I'd stopped thinking about Rachel entirely, except when her communication attempts forced her back into my consciousness. And even then, my primary emotion was annoyance at the interruption rather than any residual attachment or concern for her well-being. 3 years after the breakup, I returned to Boston for my college friend David's wedding celebration at the Harbor Hotel, bringing Amanda as my date and proudly announcing our recent engagement to the circle of friends who'd witnessed my relationship with Rachel fall apart and supported me through the difficult transition to single life. The wedding was everything David and his fiancée Sarah had dreamed of, intimate and elegant with stunning views of Boston Harbor, and I felt genuinely happy to be celebrating their commitment while wearing the engagement ring Amanda had chosen after I proposed during a sunrise hike in the Santa Monica Mountains 6 months earlier. Our engagement had been everything my planned proposal to Rachel never became: organic and mutual rather than a calculated surprise designed to secure someone's commitment. And Amanda's enthusiastic yes had confirmed what we both already knew about wanting to build a life together based on shared values and genuine compatibility. I was standing on the venue's terrace overlooking the harbor, enjoying the cool evening air and discussing Amanda's research on coral reef restoration with David's cousin who worked in environmental policy, when I spotted a familiar figure approaching across the crowded reception space. Rachel appeared unexpectedly at the wedding reception, having apparently learned about the event through the same mutual connections that had once made our social circles overlap, and I watched her navigate the crowd with the determined focus of someone who'd been planning this encounter for months. She looked different than I remembered, thinner and more carefully put together in a way that suggested she'd been preparing for this moment, wearing a dress that was probably too formal for the occasion and makeup that couldn't quite hide the stress lines around her eyes that hadn't been there during our relationship years. When she approached me during a quiet moment on the venue's terrace, I felt Amanda tense, slightly beside me before excusing herself to get drinks, demonstrating the kind of emotional intelligence and security that allowed her to give me space to handle the situation without creating drama or demanding explanations. Rachel's opening words were carefully rehearsed, complimenting how good I looked and mentioning how proud she was of my career success based on what she'd heard through mutual friends, building up to what was clearly going to be a more serious conversation about our past relationship and her current regrets. She made an emotional plea for reconciliation that revealed months of preparation and rehearsal, claiming that losing me had taught her the value of genuine partnership over superficial excitement, and begging me to consider that our 7-year history together deserved another chance rather than being permanently dismissed because of one mistake she'd made during a period of confusion. Her voice carried the desperation of someone who'd spent 3 years discovering that excitement wasn't sustainable, and that financial security without emotional connection left her feeling empty and unsatisfied with the choices she'd made in pursuit of a lifestyle that proved less fulfilling than the stability she'd abandoned. She insisted that Trevor had been a temporary lapse in judgment brought on by fear of settling down too young, and that watching me build a successful new life had made her realize that I represented everything she actually wanted from a partner, rather than everything she'd convinced herself was holding her back from achieving her potential. The conversation felt surreal, like being asked to audition for a role I'd already played and found unsatisfying, particularly when she mentioned specific details about my promotion and relationship with Amanda that suggested she'd been monitoring my life through social media and mutual acquaintances for the entire 3 years we'd been apart. I listened to her complete her prepared speech before calmly explaining that forgiveness didn't equal reconciliation, and that Amanda represented the kind of partnership built on mutual respect and shared values rather than convenience and familiarity that had characterized much of our 7-year relationship even before Trevor entered the picture. When I mentioned that Amanda and I were engaged, Rachel's composure finally cracked, and I watched her face process the reality that I'd moved completely beyond our relationship, rather than remaining available as a backup option she could return to when her other choices proved unsatisfactory. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the terrace, she could see Amanda laughing with David's family, clearly comfortable and integrated into my current life, in ways that demonstrated this wasn't a rebound relationship, but a genuine partnership that had replaced what Rachel and I had built together. I reflected on how true closure came not through any dramatic confrontation with Rachel, but through the gradual process of building a life that aligned with my actual values and aspirations, rather than compromising those principles to accommodate someone else's expectations and constantly shifting definitions of what constituted an acceptable relationship. The conversation on the terrace had reconnected weren't motivated by genuine love or regret, but by the recognition that she traded substance for superficial excitement and was now dealing with the long-term consequences of prioritizing status and adventure over compatibility and shared commitment to building something lasting together. Her current desperation stemmed from realizing that Trevor had represented everything she thought she wanted, but nothing she actually needed, leaving her emotionally and financially destabilized. While I'd moved forward into a relationship that provided both excitement and security through genuine partnership rather than performance and negotiation. I recognized that Rachel's claim about wasted years revealed her fundamental misunderstanding of relationships as transactions rather than partnerships, viewing our 7 years together as an investment that should have guaranteed specific returns rather than a shared experience that had value regardless of its eventual outcome. The fact that she'd spent 3 years monitoring my progress through social media and mutual friends suggested she'd never actually moved on from our relationship, but had been waiting for me to fail or for her other options to prove unsatisfactory before attempting to reclaim what she'd voluntarily abandoned. When I rejoined Amanda inside the reception venue, she immediately asked if I was okay and whether I needed to talk about the conversation, demonstrating the kind of secure support that made difficult situations feel manageable rather than overwhelming or threatening to our relationship stability. I explained what had happened without minimizing Rachel's desperation or dramatizing my own emotional response, and Amanda listened with the kind of empathetic understanding that allowed her to support me without making the situation about her own insecurity or need for reassurance about my commitment to our future together. The story concluded with Amanda and me planning our California wedding for the following spring, surrounded by friends who celebrated our authentic connection, rather than questioning whether we were settling for convenience or making compromises that would eventually lead to dissatisfaction and betrayal. We'd chosen a venue in La Jolla overlooking the ocean where we'd first met during that beach cleanup volunteer project, symbolizing how our relationship had grown from shared values and activities rather than physical attraction or social pressure to couple up for practical reasons. My final insight centered on the distinction between people who leave because they want something genuinely different versus those who leave because they want to feel different about themselves, and how my happiness now came from choosing someone who appreciated the person I actually was rather than someone who saw me as a project to be improved or a stepping stone to something better. I understood that Rachel had served as an important lesson about recognizing when someone views you as a placeholder rather than a destination, and that her return had actually been a gift that confirmed I'd made the right choices in prioritizing authentic partnership over familiar comfort. The wedding planning process with Amanda felt joyful rather than stressful because we were both committed to creating an event that reflected our values and included the people who'd supported our relationship rather than performing happiness for social media or trying to prove something to people who doubted our compatibility from the beginning. Looking back, I could see that Rachel's betrayal had been the catalyst I'd needed to discover what I actually wanted from life and relationships, forcing me to develop the confidence to pursue authentic connection rather than settling for someone who'd made it clear through words and actions that I wasn't enough to satisfy their ambitions or dreams. Transcribed by TurboScribe AI. Go unlimited to remove this message.